See some friendly faces here. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself. I see the chat is still there from last time. I didn't know that persisted. That's a new feature. Feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself, where you're from. Hey, Andrew.
Hello, was that aimed at me? Sorry.
No, sorry, just in the chat on the side, Andrew.
Oh, thank you.
Feel free to go and introduce yourself and where you're from. I'll go through some group norms in a moment. I keep wanting to play some elevator music as I start this, but I keep forgetting to add it to the presentation. I won't sing. That's why I brought Bart, my colleague. He's going to do some karaoke for us.
I love karaoke.
I know. I know that well. Hello, Della from Leo Academy Trust in London. Andre from Johannesburg. Hey, Jürgen from Helsingborg. Claire. Kim's Wi-Fi just died. I'm sorry. Hello, Lee. A truly international crowd today. This is great to see. Andrew, you're Torbay. I'm in Totnes. I'm just up the road. Head down. Okay, great. What I'm going to do is, I realized I wasn't sharing a screen. So I will load that back up and I will start the recording. Oh, it's already recording, which is great. Someone's done my job for me. Welcome to the March version of our IT Community Admin Meetup. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. My name's Ollie. I'm one of our solutions engineers on the Google for Education team. So I work with a wonderful team of colleagues all over Europe, Middle East and Africa, helping organizations successfully deploy Google for Education, so Workspace and Chromebooks, in both the K-12 and the higher ed scenario. So on this call, we might have people from K-12, we might have people from higher education, we might have some wonderful folks from our Google for Education partners. So it's a really nice place where once a month we meet here, go through a key topic, look at some product updates, and then open up the floodgates to questions that you might have and have a kind of discussion around any problems or concerns you might have with Google Workspace, and then try and address those together. Great place to go and ask for top tips, or just sit back and listen with a coffee as well. So this is a Google Meet. I hope many of you have used this before. There'll be some functions you're familiar with. Please keep yourself muted for most of it. If you want to, there'll be time where you can go through and ask questions if you wish. If you have a live question you want to ask through any of this conversation, please use the hand raise function. But likewise, I'll be keeping a monitor of the Google chat. So if you have any questions as we go through and you don't want to raise a hand, feel free to just chuck your questions in the chat here as well. And this month, we're focusing on Google Vault. So Google Vault is a really awesome archiving tool built into Google Workspace. We're going to do a bit of a deep dive looking into some of the best practices, unpick some of the subtle nuances around retention, custom rules, holds, matters, exports, etc., to help you really understand what's happening, and then give you some kind of ideas about how you might want to go through and use this. We'll discuss some limitations, so where Google Vault is not a backup tool, but more of a retention tool, and then we can maybe have some conversations about what folks might be using for backup rather than archiving. As usual, we'll go and look at some updates that have happened in the last month since we met in February, and then look forward to next month. And then time permitting, we can open up to some general discussions, ideally about Google for Education, but if we're short on that, we could discuss anything. We'll try and keep politics and world events off this call, but keep it focused on just something that's within our remit of control, if that's all right. So we'll start with Google Vault. So Vault is a tool that's included to all Google for Education subscriptions. It's worth noting that for enterprises, it is sometimes an additional cost, but we include this for free, even on Google for Education fundamentals. As I mentioned, my voice is going, so I'm going to keep pausing for drinking water, I'm afraid, today. And in here, we'll cover just what Google Vault is. We'll look at data retention and how you can use this for information governance best practices. And then also, if you have something like a subject access request, how you could go through and use it as an e-discovery tool. And then what's also really important is obviously because Google Vault has great power, such as the ability to go through and search and read users' email or Drive files, it's really important that you understand the audit process and maybe how you might go through and configure certain alerts to do this. So Google Vault is an e-discovery tool. It's worth noting it is not a backup tool, but it basically allows you as an admin to go through and set retention policies, also search information that's happening within your Google instance, and export data should you need it. It is not a disaster recovery tool. So what that means is if you have, for example, an issue, maybe there is some ransomware that's infected local drive for desktop and it's cleared out some Microsoft Office files, Google Vault is not the best way to get that back to how it was. So there is no way from Google Vault to restore a user's Google Drive or restore a user's Gmail. There are a number of really great third-party backup solutions that integrate with Google Workspace that we would recommend if you need some disaster recovery or backup solutions that you use instead of Google Vault, or as well as, absolutely. So Google Vault is really great. It just works. It's a well-staffed core service tool that you have access to. It's got really great access control policies, so you can choose which users have access to it or not. It's pretty simple. It's all web-based. There is an API if you want to extend this. And so we've got some examples where I can share an example with you that I shared maybe last month that uses the Google Vault API to get data from Gemini prompts and responses in Google Vault onto a spreadsheet. So you can do automations with Google Vault, which can be useful for configuring regular exports to a local backup. But as I said, it is not a backup tool. It is a retention and archiving tool as well. And you can customize this. So you don't have to have the same policies for all your users. You may have different policies for retention for active users versus suspended. And then you may have certain types of students. Maybe in the UK, there is a policy where looked after children might need to have their data retained for longer than somebody who is not. So lots of different policies you can go through and configure there. There is the ability to search, view, and export data. And providing you have a sufficient retention rule, what's really great is you can use Google Vault to get access to data that has been accidentally or intentionally deleted by a user. And this is really useful, particularly in a school environment. Some examples we hear where Google Vault comes to the rescue is where a student accidentally deletes all of their coursework material and clears it from their trash. And then if there is a Google Vault hold on that file, then it's really easy for an administrator to go through, get those files, export them, and give them back to the student. So there's no loss of data, which is really useful. It's really useful for things under GDPR. If you've done a DPIA where you have said, hey, we need to keep our data for 5 years, but no longer, you can apply rules that automatically purge data from Gmail, for example, 5 years after they were sent or received. Or on Google Drive, you can set policies to delete data that isn't been used, accessed, edited in a year, for example. So really useful policies for GDPR, POPIA, other great kind of industry regulations as well. And then from an e-discovery perspective, it's really useful if you're ever engaged in any legal proceedings or subject access requests, where you can apply things called holds, which will take priority and precedence over any retention rules that you might have. So if you have a legal reason to keep a hold on a user's data while they're going through an investigation, you can do that without having to create custom retention rules, etc., to go through and configure this. We cover these services here. One thing that we've just added support for is also Gemini, which I thought I added as a little circle that popped up but I think that was on an erroneous old deck, unfortunately. But we also support Gemini, and hopefully there's support for Notebook LM coming soon. But right now, Gemini services is included here as well. So we'll go in and have a look at a live view of Google Vault in a moment. But basically, when you go to the homepage, there is a couple of things to be aware of. So the default retention rule applies to each of these services across the entire organization unit. And you can set this for indefinite. So if you want to keep data indefinitely while you have your users active, this is actually a really positive thing to do if you want to support and protect against a user accidentally or intentionally deleting their data, and this allows you to go through and recover it. So we would recommend, if you don't have any DPIA or public facing policies that are saying, hey, I need to keep my data for 5 years and then we're going to expunge it. If you say that we're going to expunge data after 5 years, you should have an appropriate policy to do so. But if you don't have such a policy, indefinite is a really good catch-all to support that here as well. There are also custom retention rules where you can apply different policies for different services. So you can set as many custom rules as you need. And what's important is that the longest retention rule applied to any data is the one that will take precedence. So what I mean by that is if you have a default rule where you're keeping users' mail data for 2 years, as an example, but there is a custom rule applied to a certain organization of units where you're only going to keep their data for 5 years, the 5 years would take the policy in that case. Likewise, if you had a rule where you want to set a 1 year only for a certain organization unit, the default rule of 2 years would take precedence because that is a longer time. So hopefully that makes sense. The latest expiration will always take precedence. And then on top of that, we also have this concept of matters, which allow you to go through and do things like search queries or configure exports or place holds. We'll take a deeper dive into this in just a moment as well. But this is where you're going to go through and actually when you have something to interact with, an action to take, it's going to happen through matters. We have Google Vault Search, which is really useful, where you can search across Gmail, Drive, all of the service data. You can search specific accounts broadly across organization units, how you need as well. And there's, for some of these services, the ability to really customize your search or your export based on terms, dates it was sent or received, etc. And lots of elements you can go through and do here. And then a hold is a really useful where you have an investigation. If you don't want to affect your default rules or your custom retention rules, a hold is the ability for you to place that on a user or an organization unit. And a hold will always take precedence over a retention rule, and it will choose to keep that data for as long as you have the hold applied, if that makes sense. And then obviously export is quite useful. You can create comprehensive data, export all your users' data, individual users' data, and you can go through and configure how you want that to look at. So what I'll do actually is just jump across to a Google Vault. Google Vault, by the way, you can access at vault.google.com. You will need to have administrative access in order to do so. Super admins by default have access to Google Vault. If you have the need to have a compliance or a data protection officer to have access to Google Vault, that can be configured as an admin role, and I'll go through and show how that works in just a moment as well. But it's pretty easy. There's kind of 3 key menu items here. So the first one is where you would configure your retention rules. And as we said before, there is default retention rules that are applied. And for some reason, this is not loading for me. Let me give this a quick refresh. The switch accounts, sorry. Sorry, just waking up. So here we have our default rules, and you'll see there's all those services here for default rules where you can go through and configure how long you want to configure this. You'll see that in our organization, we have chosen to keep mail and chat data only for 360 days. And so when you go through and configure one of these, you could set a retention period or indefinitely. Indefinitely acts as you expect. It's going to keep your data for as long as that user is active. And then 360 is on here. And I've got this option to choose when messages are sent or received. You have these options here as well. So this one is less intense. So this would only purge messages that a user has actively chosen to delete. Whereas this one here is a bit more end user impacting, where it's actually going to go through and delete any messages that are in Gmail mailboxes and permanently delete messages and drafts as well. So this will make sure that if you had a policy where you don't want mail to exist within an inbox longer than 360 days, that would go through and configure it. Hopefully that makes sense. You can configure different rules for Drive. There are slightly different options as well. So if I wanted to do a 365-day option in Drive, I have options where I could say from when it was created, or I could say I actually want to only have actively used files. So when it was last modified could be another option here as well. And again, like we had in Gmail, there's a permanently deleted, but also active files open in users Drive as well. I'm not going to say this because indefinite is what we want here. One thing to note, and I think I mentioned it before, is these rules will only apply to active users or suspended users. If you delete a user from your organization, their data will also delete from their account and Google Vault with it. So Google Vault, this is really important, only applies to active and suspended users that you have within your organization. It will not retain data from users who are deleted. And I will go through and reiterate that at the end, but these rules apply to active and suspended users only. So that's the default rules. In custom rules, you can go through and create specific rules here as you wish. And so you can apply these at Gmail, Drive, etc. from here. Archived user, yeah, Lee, so as long as they are active or suspended, if they have an archived user license, that's actually why we created that SKU to support you here as well. They will also be covered as well. So let's imagine if I wanted to apply a policy where I've got Gmail. So my example here, I'm deleting all users' mail after 360 days. But let's imagine I actually want to change that for an organization unit called staff as an example. Or perhaps there is a finance team, and I probably should have chosen a different demo domain where I don't have about 80,000 organization units. But let's imagine I just want to go through and apply this here to my staff organization unit. I could then go through and set custom conditions, which are optional if I want, but I don't have to do this. One thing that's sometimes quite useful is if it contains a term like finance or looked after child or anything specific, you can go through and query that here as well. You can do specific lookup. There are search terms and operators that you can configure. So if it is only mail that is sent to a certain external email address, you can go through and configure that there as well. So that can be really useful for you. I'm going to leave that option. And then you could go through and say, hey, for users in that organization unit, I want to keep their data indefinitely. Or I could set a custom retention period of 1,000 days, for example, and then go through and configure that however I wish. So really easy to configure those custom rules. And what that would mean that users within this organization unit, they would obviously still be configured by the default rule, but this custom rule would take precedence and priority because it is longer. So hopefully that makes sense. They're pretty easy to go through and configure. There is also some specific settings on here as well. So for things like Google Meet, these are Meet recordings. And some organizations from a storage policy perspective, or even a compliance policy perspective, even if they're keeping Drive data indefinitely, they might decide that meeting, they want to go through and configure a Meet rule. They could configure whether that's Drive or Meet. And then likewise for sites, they could have that just broadly covered by the sites rule, the Drive retention rule, or they could have a custom one that's configured at the sites level as well. So the reason why the sites data is added is sometimes like a school website might actually not be accessed or modified frequently, but they might still want to retain it. So you can have a custom retention rule on sites or a default rule on sites to keep that data longer because they are handled slightly differently than Drive, if that makes sense. Cool. And then there are these two options at the bottom, which are quite interesting to be like interesting of. So we have the retention rules of the drive's items owner and collaborators. So what this means is, if you remember, I looked at when it was last modified, for example, the default is it actually chooses items owner and collaborators, but you could go even more restrictive and say it's only going to be for the drive's items owner on here as well. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go back to the home screen and just very quickly look at the matters now to show you what you might want to go through and do here. So matters, you typically go through and you would create a matter for a specific investigation or purpose. So whether this is going to be a subject access request, an investigation, or maybe there is a deletion recovery option you're going to go through here. They're very easy to go through and create. You can create as many as you need. I've already got one here. They're just a useful kind of like organizing folder structure just for you to be aware of. It also helps in your auditing process because the matter name is also audited as well, which helps you identify why someone is carrying out a vault request, if that makes sense. So the easiest thing to do, the first thing you're presented with is a search here, and you can go through and choose any of these search options. Right now we have Gemini app in search, but it's not in the default rules yet. That will be coming hopefully later next month. But right now I can go through and search for specific files or services from here. Very easy to configure. You can search for all data is the default, but there's also, if you've got a hold on a user, you can go through and search as that as well. And then you can go through and for any of these, you could search for all accounts within your organization, specific accounts, or an organization unit. I'm going to go through and just search for a individual user. And then I could go through and look for specific dates. I could look for terms. However I wish. There's some advanced options on here as well. And I can just go through, and this is searching and returning all of the emails that this user has sent or received from the last 360 days, because that is how long my default retention policy applies. If I had indefinite applied, then I'd be able to go through and search indefinitely through their emails. And you'll see you get quite a lot of information here. So you can see the full email, you can see the details, you can show the original. There is actually quite a lot available to an administrator using Google Vault from this. So that's how you can search. There is also the ability to export this data. And then there is basically kind of general format. So if it is mail data, it's going to come out as an mbox or PST. If it is drive data, it will be exported as a zip file. One thing to note is Google Doc files will end up exporting as .docx files. Sheets will go to XLSX files. So these are files that generally can be read by most collaboration platforms that you might have. So you can go through and export all these kind of different options to go through and view. However, very simple to go through and do. And there's also an option to go through and just do a overall count, which is quite useful because if I'm doing an investigation and I want to see how many times a certain term was mentioned, maybe it's a bullying investigation, for example, you can go through and get a nice option available here. And then holds are useful if you are being under a legal obligation to hold data for a certain individual. You can go through and call this whatever you want. You can apply it to whatever service you want. So I could say Gmail data. I could then go through, choose a specific account, and I could choose to keep that data for as long as I need, or only look for start dates, or only data that contains certain terms. Really useful and very easy to go through and configure. And then if you have exported anything, you'll find them available here. Exports will be available for up to 30 days, and then they'll be automatically deleted. There is also the ability directly from this screen to query the audit logs. And let me just go through and sign in again. And what this will do is it will take you back to your admin console, and it will jump directly to the investigation tool. You can get here directly as well whenever you wish. So within the admin console, you'll be able to go through and look at the Vault log events, and you'll see that every Vault has a matter, and so the matter ID is available there. You can also query on general events. You can look for users, but basically everything that's happening in Google Vault is logged available here as well. And so what's quite nice is you can then go through, and if you need to, create alerts for certain things. So if I wanted to go through and look at this, so user viewed a document as an example, I could then go through and actually just go through and configure an alert whenever a user performed a document, if that makes sense. I could go through and investigate all of the options where they are configuring an actor. So I can go through and see what this user's been up to. It would go through and configure it here. But you have the option where you can go through and find all of the events where somebody viewed a document. So this is really useful because this is something that's maybe quite crucial. You might want to get alerted when somebody actually goes through and views something in Google Vault. So one thing you can do is from here, go through and create alerts however you need to as well. But really interesting to go through and configure. So I think I've covered everything that I wanted to show in Google Vault. I'm going to jump back here to just recap some of these things. So obviously make sure that your Vault retention rules match any policies that you have, particularly public-facing policies on data retention. There is lots of information configured in the audit reports, and then the actions in audit reports cannot be deleted by Google or Vault administrators as long as you continue to use Google Vault. So absolutely worth noticing that. So if somebody takes an action in Google Vault, that will be permanently logged in your records there as well. Luca asked a wonderful question: how does it impact storage space? Right now, all of your retained data in Google Vault does not impact your pooled storage. And so do with that information what you will. We've had some very creative use cases where people are using GAM, for example, to bulk purge data out of users' drive, knowing that providing they keep that user active or suspended, the data is going to persist in Google Vault if they ever needed it as a subject access request, for example. So in the university space, this is actually quite common. So when they archive users, they might have a need to keep user data for 5 years in case that student comes back and says, hey, we need my data back. But actually, they don't want terabytes of data just clogging up their drive storage. So Google Vault, applying an archive user license to those users, keeping them for 5 years, will keep the data in Google Vault. They can then just run a very simple GAM command that iterates through all of those users and purges their data. So not what Vault's designed for, but it does serve that purpose really well. If you've got any like third-party backup tools, AFI.ai is really popular. They can do similar things automated for you. It doesn't use Google Vault by default, but it would use some other third-party system. One other thing that I did want to show you, which I completely forgot, I didn't mention it, was actually who has access to Google Vault. So in the admin roles here, obviously you have super admins, but you can go through and configure a custom role. And I'm not sure if I have one already configured here. Let me just check. Nope, but I'll go through and just show you how you would configure this. So you can create a custom role. And I would say Vault Access, for example. And then in here, you can go through and configure Google Vault Access. And you could just choose whatever you want. So access all logs, view all matters, manage matters, whatever you wish to as well. You can give people the ability to configure everything in Google Vault without giving them super admin access. So this is sometimes really useful if you've got like a data protection officer who might have the ability to go through and do this. If you are doing this, just reiterate to everybody that everything is audited and advise why they shouldn't just go through snooping through people's inboxes. A bit of training is important. As I think it was Peter Parker's uncle said, with great power comes great responsibility, that philosopher, for any Spider-Man fans out there. So Google Vault is a lot of power, so just be careful how you use it. The service can be enabled for users to access in the Workspace services. So you can go through and configure here which users do or do not have access to Google Vault. And then likewise, everything is gone through and configured within the Vault process. One quick caveat I will say is you can't, if you went through and turned on indefinite today, that is going to take a snapshot pretty quickly. Give it 24 to 48 hours, I think we officially say, of retaining in Google Vault all of your data that currently exists. if I was to make a mistake and if I was to go through and change my vault retention rule from indefinitely to 1 day, that would have profound implications. It might even go through and delete any data that is more than 1 day old. So please, please, please don't just play around with these default rules. If you want to test things, my recommendation would be to create a specific organization unit with a custom test user and then go through and apply these custom rules. Custom rules work in the same way as default rules, but they allow you just a bit more granular control, which is really useful if you want to test out the implication of a certain policy before you roll it out to default. If you do a disaster and you change the default rule to delete all data older than, it's not a day older, we have seen this happen before, at least one time, please raise a support ticket as quickly as possible. After about 21 days, there's actually nothing that a support initiated process can do. So we have a legal obligation to, if you instruct us as a data processor to delete that data, it goes through a deletion flume. If you do make a mistake, please don't panic, but do raise a support ticket as quickly as possible. And if you have the contact details for myself or Bart or someone in your respective country or a Google partner you work with, please do raise it with them. The sooner we can act on that, the better. Cool. I've got this very quick what if cheat sheet that could be useful, which just goes through a couple of scenarios that I get frequently asked. So if a user deletes a file and empties the trash, what happens to the data? It's going to be removed from the user drive and their storage quota. The admin could still find it, providing there was a retention rule or a hold covering that data, which is really useful. If you have a hold and a retention conflict, the hold will always win. So the hold will preserve data indefinitely until that hold is deleted. Hold to the master trump card. Maybe trump isn't the right word to use here, but you get the idea. If there are two retention rules and there's a conflict, the longest retention period will always win. And so Vault defaults to preservation over deletion. So if there is a retention rule applying to some data, the longest will always win. If the admin deletes the user's account, that is a danger. All the Vault data for that user is purged after 20 days. Can the admin find it? The answer is no. So as Kim correctly pointed out before in the chat, please retain users with the archive user for as long as you need them to retain that data in Vault. If a student edits doc 50 times, Vault will preserve the version of the file at the time it's searched or exported, but it's not a version history tool. What I mean by that is basically every edit, there are snapshots of the file being taken that go to the version history. If you export a file on Google Vault, so if you run a search and export, that file will basically be exported at the time you specify in the export. So this is really useful if there's any potential. We do see sometimes ransomware attacks using Drive for desktop, where local Windows machines have been corrupted, and then it can actually corrupt not the Drive editor files, but maybe Microsoft proprietary files. Vault is a really good way to actually say, hey, I know we had an attack on the 12th of March. I want to export my data for this user to how all those files appeared on the 11th of March, and you can go through and export those files as they existed there. So it does provide some snapshotting. It's almost like an archive, like a cache almost, like web archive kind of style. And then likewise, if you've got the chat or Gemini history is turned off, data is not sent to Google Vault. So it's from a Vault perspective, it never existed. It's typically very ephemeral. I think we'll keep data briefly on servers for 24 hours or so. So if you don't have a chat or Gemini history configured, Google Vault will not be able to export that as well. Great, some questions coming in. Martin, does the longest retention rule not apply if default with indefinitely and custom with 365 days is set? So if the same user is covered by an indefinite and a 3,650 days set, the indefinite will win because it is longer, if that makes sense, than 10 years. I'm just going to let my dog out the door. Give me a minute because he's whining. Thank you. Love a live assistant there, Percy. And that's it. So any other questions about Google Vault? No, Martin, so when it comes to, sorry, I should go back and clarify that. So if there are two retention rules conflict, the longest will take priority. The difference is if you have a hold, the hold will always take priority over the retention rule. The hold will retain that data for as long as you have that hold on there as well. Good question. Good to clarify these things. Great stuff. So I'm going to jump into some recent product updates. So these are things that have launched, and there's a lot of them since we last met at the end of February. So looking at this month, we have got Gemini in Chrome rolling out to a couple new countries with support for more languages. I will go through and copy this link and paste it in the chat for you in case you would like to find out more information about Gemini in Chrome. We are also starting to see this roll out to Chromebook Plus as well, which is really useful for any of your teachers, for example, or staff members using Chromebook Plus. One thing to caveat is this is available to users who are designated as 18 plus in your organization. We had a tool called Whisk, which is an AI-powered image and video creation that is coming to Flow. Flow will very shortly be launching as a standalone service that you can enable for users. It's a bit like using VO3, but in a broader perspective to make really comprehensive, longer form videos where you can have the same characters persisting scene through scene. So a really useful tool if you want to create explainer videos, for example, which is very useful. We now have the ability in Gmail to go through and use the Help Me Schedule to take everybody within that and provide some options. It used to be just one-to-one calendar option, but this is applying in Gmail to users with the Google AI Pro for Education option. We have Google Calendar on large monitors. So something that I've noticed recently is actually much better automatic dynamic density support on calendars as you change and reduce your screen size. Small UI addition, but it caught me off guard a little bit at first when something that I thought was a 30-minute meeting looked like a 2-hour meeting, but it's just because the density I was used to is now very different. We've also got the ability to assign calendars to Google Meet hardware now in bulk, which is useful if you have any Google Meet hardware in your organization. And again, likewise, we've got device ID for Google Meet hardware to make it even easier to go through and configure. We have got delegate updates from the principal calendar. So one thing is if you have any delegated like inbox or delegated calendar, you can now see this more consistently across calendar as well as Gmail as well. So if any of you are lucky enough to have like an executive administrator assistant, this will make their lives more easier and for those you work with. I'm not quite senior enough yet in Google to have such a luck, but hey, maybe in a few years. We've also got some better dynamic drop downs in chat apps. So if you are building any custom chat apps in your organization, you can now configure drop downs, which work really nicely. We've got better support between Calendar and Google Meet. So the Meet video calls will now be tied to the original calendar event, which is really useful. There was some confusion before about reusing the same Meet codes across multiple events, but this will just basically improve that user experience to make it much easier to go back and find things like recordings. Google Meet events, we've got a couple of options here as well. So we've got some additional log details. So not only who joined, but which participant admitted them. So we heard quite a lot that if you're allowing external users in the logs, it would be really useful to understand who let them in. And it was whether they had a knock or whether they had delegated authentication. So whether they were allowed via an invite, for example. So really useful to go through and see if you need to. And then last month, there was a few that came out after we last met. So as I mentioned, Gemini in Chrome is Mac OS, Windows, and select Chrome OS. So on Chrome OS, Chromebook Plus devices, that'll be available. It's available to Chrome Enterprise Premium if you have Chrome OS. And then, sorry, this is Chrome Enterprise Premium. That should be available just with the Chrome Education upgrade. I'll go back and double check that there as well. And then we launched Nano Banana 2 to all users, which is basically a more advanced version of our really powerful Nano Banana model. It's incredible with things like text, photorealism, really, really useful. It used to only be available to pro customers, but we now made it available to all users. It's great for things like infographics. which is very useful. And then we've also got conversation history, which can be configured or enable users to delete their conversation history when they're using Gemini in Workspace. And very soon, I know it's a top feature request, we will also provide this functionality into the Gemini chat app. We hear a lot that users want to be able to selectively delete their chats, but you also might want to retain that data in Google Vault. So coming hopefully early next month, there'll be the ability to delete conversation history as an end user on your Gemini app. And then we've got some additional support from languages for AI avatars and voiceovers. So specifically French, German, Italian, Korean, Portuguese, Spanish, and Japanese. So really definitely worth playing around with if you are from one of those, speak one of those languages. And we've also got some really great cartoon avatars, which sometimes are a bit more playful than having like a photorealistic human. So these are available in Google AI Pro for Education, but we've also dropped these down to Teaching and Learning and Education Plus users as well. What's really nice about Google Forms Insights is we've now got some better options around the AI response summary, which kind of includes response counts and percentages across different themes, which is quite useful. So we actually added like sentiment analysis into this as well, but this takes it a bit further and allows you to actually export the theme percentages. So you want to see how many users were really annoyed about the upgrade to the cafeteria menu versus how many were actually really positive about those changes. It can now automatically give you a nice summary of the sentiment analysis or the themes on Google Prompts, on Google Forms, which is really, really useful. We've got the ability to save PDFs to Drive directly from within that section there, and you can actually go through and choose your Drive account from your computer, which is useful. We've also got a couple of things where we're allowing managers a bit more functionality in Google Groups, so you can delegate more, delegate other members to do things like edit the group's name if you need as well. So this is useful for extracurricular activities, things like that you might have. And then there is also some better kind of options before you start on meeting tools about Gemini transcriptions, take notes for me, for example. So sometimes you might want to have this on for most calls, but maybe there's a sensitive meeting where you don't want this to happen. You go through and turn this off before you start the call, which is useful. We've got some better support for access controls on Windows devices. I'll go through and chuck this support article in the chat because it's quite useful. And it basically allows you to do a bit more without having to overwrite existing local admin privileges, which is really useful. And then we've also added a really handy feature in the Gemini reports section of the admin console that go through and give a bit more detail into not only how users are using Gemini or whether they're using it in certain documents, but also how users are using some of the advanced usage. So generating videos, for example, using flows, you can go through and see how these users are interacting, but also for some of these, there are daily capacities. So they can only run X number of deep research per month, for example. You can then go through and see whether there's any users at limit, which is really useful. And it can be useful to identify actually, hey, I've got a license that I've got sitting spare, this user's regularly at their limit. Maybe I want to give it to them who will actually get real benefit from those increased usage as well. So very useful increased reports. You'll find those in the admin console in the Gemini or generative AI section. Just head into Gemini reports and you should see that now. And we've also added into Google Classroom the ability for teachers as they're grading to go through and give some specific AI generated functionality. Right now it's pretty rudimentary. You can go through and just set a target grade level, tell it what you want to focus on. Coming soon, we'll have better support for things like rubrics, the ability to upload specific grading criteria, and really support with that generated feedback process for teachers to not only save teacher time, but also improve the feedback process for students to really like critically identify where they're going right or wrong. And then we've got some take notes for me configuration. So if you are on the Gemini Alpha, if you have that enabled for you, there is some Google AI note-taking functionality as well. So the ability to auto-enable take notes for me if you wish, which is really useful. I've done it a few times, got to the end of the meeting and said, oh yeah, I'll review the Gemini notes, but someone forgot to turn it on at the beginning. So you can't retrospectively go through and do this. So having that automatically on is really useful. And this automatic note-taking for schedule meetings with specific number of guests is a really useful tool as well. And then Lyria, I don't know whether this has got too much pedagogical aspect, but it's quite fun. You can actually get Gemini to create 30-second songs for you based on your prompt, which is really nice. So again, pedagogy, TBD, but fun, definitely yes. And then we bought a few things like audio summaries. So this is like the podcast approach that you might be familiar with in Notebook LM, the ability to get that directly in Google Docs, which is really useful. Sometimes you don't want to actually go through, take a big document, take it to Notebook LM and then generate the audio summary. So that's available for AI Pro users directly within the tool section. And then if you're using Figma, we know a lot of schools are using like FigJam, which is free for education users. There is a better support for Figma directly in Google Chat as well, which could be useful. Not many people have Google Meet hardware, but we've got some better video calling options. We've got DLP policies coming from Google Calendar. So this can be quite useful. We had the request that we didn't want sensitive data like the description. If there is some information about, I don't know, perhaps you've got health data about a student that you don't want externally shared, you can go through and configure DLP rules on Calendar now, which is useful. And this I love. So in Google Meet now, you can actually go through and if someone's presenting something to you and you've got your chat open and maybe you've got captions, sometimes the window can look really small. You now have the ability to click a button and basically get this resizable window just for the presentation, which is really useful if you're working on like a multiple desktop screen and you can just go through and change that whilst keep the Google Meet chat in one place, which is really cool. And that's it. So lots of updates in just a month, which is wild. So we can open up for Q&A. What I will do, I'm conscious we've got 12 minutes, so I'll just very quickly outline how there's a couple of sessions coming up in the next month or so that might be useful for you. So the next one of these will be at the end of April, the last Thursday in April. And that's GMT time 10 to 11. So if you're CET, that's 11 till 12, or wherever else you are in the world, please adjust accordingly. You can sign up for these in the same way you got here, either on our K-12 or our higher education short link. And another thing that might be useful for you is it's run by some of my American colleagues, but there's a really nice overview on securing your admin console. So like data protection and threat response policies. So if that's of interest to you, that's slightly later, it's US time. But if you're kicking around or eating your dinner, it might be fun to go through and watch that while you do as well. So there's a couple of sessions available that you might be interested in. So let's just kind of bring it back. Any questions about anything that came up today, feel free to ask in the chat or unmute yourself, or if there's anything else that you think might be useful for us all to discuss. I don't know how many people we've got here, 75 or so. So yeah, don't be shy. Likewise, if you just want to go get a coffee in 11 minutes before your next meeting, that's also fine. I won't judge if we have a slurry of people leaving either. But I am around, certainly for the next 10 minutes. Hey, Per, any more languages coming to take notes for me, perhaps Swedish? Cool, so I will go through and double check that for you. What I'll do is I'll put a note. I've got your email there anyway, to follow up. Typically what we see is we have English as like the #1 language that gets released. Then we typically see those languages that I mentioned earlier. So French, German, Italian, Korean, Portuguese. There's some others, Japanese, I can't remember. And then Swedish is typically in the next tranche there as well. One thing I will say is there's normally like a 2 to 3 month delay in all of these before we get released. I will also say that actually we are now so confident in Gemini's like ability to work in multiple languages, but before we actually used to have to do quite a lot of like, particularly for Google Classroom, right? So for Google Classroom, there's a Gemini tab in Google Classroom that some of you might be familiar with. We chose not to release that to loads of languages at the start because we wanted to do some deep pedagogical evaluations. But actually, the more we go through this, the more we realize that Gemini is just fantastic in in most languages anyway. So we're starting to just not go through that laborious evaluation process that we have done historically. So what you will hopefully see, Per, is a bit more of an increased cadence on getting features we release out to more languages much quicker. So I'll go through and find the specific date for you for Notes for Meet, but just rest assured that going forwards, we should see, hopefully by this time next year, we won't even be thinking about it. We'll be releasing everything in all languages all at once. Yeah, and Per, Norwegian's always late as well. So fingers crossed we can speed that up with AI supporting us here as well. Welsh again, yeah. So Welsh, Matt, we're still, there is some pedagogical evals. I don't think the Gemini, if I remember correctly, Matt, is not available in Welsh yet. But once we get that, we typically see a really rapid approach to things, or the potential for rapid approach. So watch this space for Welsh on there. Good question, Per. Thank you. Well, it looks like we're maybe at a natural pause here. So I will close this meeting very soon and stop the recording. It will be published quite soon. I think that my wonderful colleague Caroline might be on, but very soon we'll have this up and running for you as well. I see another question from Per actually. Again, Gemini in Classroom to more languages coming very soon. Hopefully I'll be able to share some specific dates with you next month. But on that, I will go through, stop the recording